Well, good morning, everyone. If we haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Ben Anderson. I'm one of the pastors here. I just want to take this time to welcome everyone to church, especially if you are a first-time guest. I don't know what brought you here, but I'm glad you're here, and I hope that you have a great experience this morning. And I actually believe this is the perfect time to join us because we're at the front end of a new series called The Best Church Ever, which means you have very little to catch up on, but if you do want to catch up, you can always go to our website and catch every part that maybe you've missed, which right now is only one. So like I said, it is the perfect time that you are here. But we do strive to be the best church ever, and part of those conversations happen at our annual meeting. And so if you are a member here, that's going to happen on January 25th, right after the service, where we're going to talk about, hey, what went well last year? What can we get better at, and where are we going in the future as we have conversations around that. And so if you're a member, don't miss out on that. Well, just recently, every one of us, we all said goodbye to 2025 and hello to 2026. And when these things happen, it's just a natural time to reflect on our lives, to think about the past year. Like I said, what went well, what went poorly, what can we get better at? And even if you're not a resolution person, my guess is there's probably something on your bucket list in your mind that you thought, yeah, I could probably do better with that. Maybe it's a diet thing. You're like, I'm gonna cut out sugars, I'm gonna cut out carbs, or I'm gonna do some intermittent fasting or something like that. Or maybe you're like me, and you just gotta say no to those lemon thin Oreos, because when they show up at the house, like, I'm not sharing those things. Family size, it's all me, one setting. One Vikings game, first quarter of the Vikings game, gone, right? And so I just know this year, 2026, we just can't bring them home. Like, it's just not gonna happen. I have no self-control, and maybe that's you. Or maybe this year, you've been looking back, you're looking at your bank statement, and you're thinking, I need to do better. Or I stumbled into some debt. I got a lease or a loan I never should have gotten in hindsight. I should have been satisfied with what I had. Or maybe I maxed out those credit cards, now I'm living in debt, and this year, I'm gonna pay off that debt. I'm gonna give first. I'm gonna save second, and I'm gonna live on the rest, trusting that God has provided me enough. Or maybe for you, it's stepping into marriage counseling. And you know, it's long overdue, but you've had the excuses, it costs money, we don't have time, but now it's just getting so serious that you just finally, you're at such odds, like, we have to do this. We have to invest in one of the most important things in our life that we can possibly invest into. Or maybe for you, it's not serious. In fact, your marriage is great. And you want to just, as I call it, check the oil, right? Do some regular maintenance, maybe make some time, find some space, go on that trip just alone, or go to that marriage conference to just get a little bit better. We strive every year to be a little bit better. And as a church, we're no different, right? Every year we want to reflect, we want to think, we want to be strategic, we want to be mindful of what happened, and we want to move into something better. And so as we're doing that, we have all sorts of thoughts and all sorts of conversations. And this isn't to be famous or to be big. That's definitely not the goal. It's to have an impact with the people that God has lovingly provided to us in our community, in our church, and all the people that we interact with. Because I know this and you know this. Many of you in this room, right? You're going through a hard time, and that's why you're here. Your marriage isn't going well, parenting isn't going well, and so you show up at church looking for something. We know there's people who are far from God, and we want to be a church for them. We know that we have people who want to just have a better relationship with God, and we want to be the best church ever for them. For the kids who make their way to our kids' ministry, man, I know that you grandparents, you parents, right, you are hoping we're the best church ever for your kids. When those teens invite a different teen, we want to be the best church ever when they show up to our youth ministry. And I know for every single person in this room, when you take that risk and you invite a friend, maybe that's today, you're hoping, I hope this is the best sermon ever, right? I hope the music's good, I hope the donuts are good. I want everything to be great because I spoke positively of this place. And if you let me down, I don't know if I'll ever forgive you because that's embarrassing. We want to be the best church ever. So the question is, how do we know if we are the best church ever? Right? How do we get feedback on that besides just talking amongst ourselves? Well, throughout this series, what we've been doing is we have been diving into the book of Revelation, where Jesus himself is giving feedback to 7 different churches in a real time, in a real place in Asia, and telling them, hey, this is what's going well. This is what's not going well. And this is where you can improve. And so we're taking the feedback that Jesus gave to them, bringing it into our own personal lives and into our church, and asking ourselves the question is, what are we doing well? And what can we do better? Now, I already know this about some of you guys. When you hear, oh, did he just say the book of Revelation? It makes you a little bit uncomfortable. Because I think I've found this to be true as a pastor and just as a follower of Christ, that when I bring up the book of Revelation, people have 2, oftentimes, just extreme viewpoints on it. Either it makes them so nervous, they never want to read it, never want to look about it, never want to talk about it. It's just filled with things that make them uncomfortable. They don't know how to read it. It's confusing. And so we'll just kind of put that over here and we'll focus on the other 65 books of the Bible. But for others, maybe you, right? We love this book. We obsess about this book. There's so much mystery and intrigue in it. And so we want to focus on it all of the time. And I would say this, both extremes are probably not the best, but I understand them. I mean, the book of Revelation, it's weird, it's unique. I mean, in chapter 4, there is a talk of a creature that has wings and eyeballs on the front and the back all over the whole body. I mean, that's weird. In chapter 9, it talks about this creature, though the creature has teeth like a lion, the face like a human. It's a locust and it has a crown on its head and then it has a stinger like a scorpion. I mean, that's like horror movie type stuff that my parents wouldn't let me watch, right? That's what that looks like. So I understand why some people might avoid this because of all the weird stuff. But like I said, we don't want to fall into the extremes. We don't want to just ignore it because of that, but we also don't want to be completely obsessed with it. And this is why I say that. Because if we don't read it, we actually miss out on a blessing. In fact, in chapter 1 of Revelation, then the final chapter of Revelation, chapter 22, it says, you will be blessed when you read these words, hear these words, live these words. Which means if we ignore it, put it on the shelf, we miss out on a blessing. But also, I think that if we only obsess about this book, we also miss out on a blessing, because what are we doing by default? We're ignoring the other 65 books of the Bible filled with deep application for everyday life. And so as we enter back into this book, this polarizing book, we want to look at that piece, that deep application and that deep truth for our lives. So let's lean back into Revelation, this time in chapter 2, verse 8. This is how it begins. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. So right away, we get a picture of who's talking. It's Jesus, right? He's the one who died and came back to life again. He's the first and the last. So it's actually Christ saying these words to John, ultimately to someone who's identified here as the angel. Now, scholars debate about this, but the Greek word is angelos, which can go in a couple different directions. It means messenger. So for some scholars, they say, yeah, he's speaking to a little angel who's basically overseeing this church, or he's speaking to the messenger or the primary pastor of this church, giving him feedback for this church. But no matter where we land in that spectrum, we know for sure they live in this city in Asia called Smyrna. Now, this is significant because in the first century, Smyrna was a beautiful, impressive place. I mean, already in the first century, they had paved roads. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal. Also inside the city, they had this massive U-shaped stadium that was huge. It was used for public speakers and athletics and all sorts of large group gatherings. It held 20,000 people. Now, to give you context for how big and how impressive that is, in our modern day, our NBA stadiums hold about 20,000 people. And they already had this back in the first century. Outside of that, they had this incredibly sophisticated library that would draw people from miles around, which means they had the best doctors, they had the best scholars, they had the best speakers, because this is where you had to go to find your information. It's not like today where they had the internet, we all can pull up our phones and basically have a library in our pocket, right? No, you had to go. Some of you guys are old enough, you remember what it was like when I was a kid, right? We had to go to a place to find information. It didn't show up at our doorstep or on our phone. And so all these wise people gathered. This was an incredibly amazing place. So what's the problem? Well, you're living in this beauty. What is the issue? Well, we find out in verse 9. It says this, to the church, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but a synagogue of Satan. So here we find these Christians. They're living in this beautiful place, but they're going through incredibly difficult times. Now, why is this happening? Well, there's three segments of the population, which the Christians were definitely the minority in this situation. There was the Romans, and the Romans practiced what's called, it's an imperial cult. So they would worship their emperor as God. Now, they had other gods, but you had to. It was mandated that you worship the emperor as God. Now, the Jewish people living in that context, they actually got a special religious exemption, so they didn't have to do that. But they worshiped Yahweh. And we're talking about not the Jews who had claimed Christ as Messiah. We're talking about the Jews who had rejected Christ as Messiah. That's why Jesus calls them the synagogue of Satan. They'd bought into the ultimate lie that anyone can buy into, which is Christ is not God and Christ is not the Messiah. And so here's these two factions. And the Christians don't land in either category, and this is problematic. And without that religious exemption, what's happening? Well, they're outsiders. They're outlaws in this Roman-ruled area. And the Jewish people, they weren't going to take them in, because guess what? They rejected Christ as Messiah. And so they didn't fit in anywhere, and they experienced all sorts of trouble because of this. There was no jobs for them, no businesses for them, ultimately no money for them. But in the midst of this, what does Jesus say? He says these people have no money, no jobs, no businesses. He says, you are rich. And they're thinking, I don't think we are, right? They're wrestling through life. Maybe some of you feel that. But this is what Jesus is saying to them and ultimately to us, is that the best churches focus on the eternal. Or maybe if you want to personalize this morning, you could say, hey, the best followers of Christ focus on the eternal. And this is hard. It's hard in life. It's hard for Christians living in Smyrna because they're surrounded by all this beauty. To be honest, it's hard for us as people who live in Minnesota. I mean, we are surrounded by all this amazing natural beauty around us. I mean, we have lakes. If you guys don't own a cabin, you probably know somebody who does. You can just stare at that beauty that we get to live in every single day. We have the Mayo Clinic in Rochester where people, royalty from all over the planet come to our state for care. There's beautiful homes and impressive schools. We even have US Bank Stadium and Target Field, these amazing places with mediocre teams. It's great. You see, compared to the rest of the world, in fact, even compared to the rest of the United States, we live very charmed lives. And it's so easy to get distracted. And I think this is why Jesus says these words in the book of Mark. He says, still others, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Now, what I'm not saying is you have to get rid of all your stuff and all your beautiful things. Of course, that's not the case. What Jesus is saying here is that don't get distracted by the beautiful things or the money in this life. If that's the case, it'd be better not to have it. Now, he's not saying you have to toss it, right? I'm not saying you have to get rid of all your money. But know what holds on to your heart. In fact, what I've seen, and this is true, time and time again, is those who are captured by Jesus and have their focus set on him. When he provides them beautiful things and resources. I've never seen people who have been more generous with what they have and made a larger impact in the world for Christ because they had their priorities straight. But once again, this is challenging. That's not easy. That's a muscle that we need to work on. Because so often in our lives, what naturally happens is we work a job that we hate to buy things that we don't need to impress people that we don't like. That's the reality of life, isn't it? We chase after those things, but instead Christ calls us to change our perspective to focus on eternity. And when we do this, it changes everything. Because when we look at life in light of eternity, we realize that as followers of Christ, people who have a relationship with God that doesn't end in this life but begins now and goes on to eternity, guess what? We are rich. And every single person, no matter how many commas they have in their bank account, if they don't have that same relationship with God, they are poor and they are to be pitied. Here's where the writer goes next in verse 10. It says, "Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown." Now, once again, why are they going to suffer? What's going on in this point in time, this real moment in a real time in the first century? Well, like I said, there's three realities, these three factions, and they don't fit. Christians don't fit well in this triad. So they're getting fired from their jobs. If they had a business, even if they made a bunch of money, guess what? They're getting boycotted. There's no money. They're hungry. And because they weren't following Roman rule, they actually were succumbing to legalized seizure of their property. On top of that, they were lied about. They were called atheists by one group and called cannibals by another group because of how they would speak about the sacrament. They were imprisoned, and ultimately they were executed. Remember that big, beautiful stadium that held 20,000 people? These people went from watching their sports heroes there to dying there by being eaten by wild animals or being burned alive. And this is scary stuff. In fact, when this church is hearing these words, I got to imagine that many of them were probably thinking, well, I think I'm good. Like maybe this Jesus thing isn't worth it. And I think that's why Jesus steps in and says, well, your suffering is only going to last 10 days. Now, what he's not saying is start counting. Like, okay, it's been 3 days since I was persecuted. So it's not what he's saying, right? He's saying it's going to be a short time, especially in light of eternity. I mean, if eternity is forever, then everything is just a dot on the page. So he says, hold on tight. We can make it through. Ultimately, what is Jesus saying to us as a church, saying to you as a person, is the best churches don't operate from fear. Once again, if you want to personalize this, the best followers of Christ don't operate from a spirit of fear. And I think you know this, because in your life, isn't it true that every time you've succumbed to fear, it's led to compromise? It happens in churches all the time. Right? There's certain things that maybe we don't want to teach on because we don't want to get labeled as a bigot or hateful. Or maybe we want to seem relevant, so we're just going to kind of move and shift with whatever popularity tells us in the time or whatever the main political ideology is at the time. Like if we can just move and shift, we'll always be relevant as a church. We're willing to avoid cancel culture, so we don't talk about certain things because we're scared to, because then someone might leave, and if they leave, well, maybe they'll take their money with, and that's a problem. Or maybe we're simply afraid of the outside world. So instead of viewing the church as a hospital to invite people into for care, we view it as a fortress. And if we can just keep it close, put up walls, keep people out, well, then we'll be safe. We won't have any problems. You see, fear leads to compromise every single time. But there's only one thing that the Bible tells us to fear. This is what Jesus said in the book of Matthew. It says, do not be afraid for those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. What Jesus is saying is there's one thing to fear, and it's God, and it's the reality of what is your relationship with God. Do you have one with God? Do you not have one with God? Does that mean you're going to spend eternity separated from God if you don't? Or eternity with God for those who do have that relationship with God? You see, if that is the case, and it is the case, then we are set free as people. We don't have to fear sickness. We don't have to fear death. We don't have to fear war or famine. We don't have to fear government overreach. We don't have to fear economic instability. We don't have to fear not being popular, not making the team. We are set free. But when we operate from fear, it messes up the church and it messes up our lives. Because I don't know about you, but I'm sure you're probably like me, that some of my biggest regrets in life have stemmed from fear. It was driven by fear. Maybe some of these sound like you. Right? You spent money you didn't have because you wanted to win her over and then you didn't. Or you want to take your family on that vacation and now you're swimming in debt. Or maybe it's the opposite. You just aren't generous because you're so scared you got to hold on to everything you have, and now people perceive you in a way that you don't want to be perceived. Or maybe you didn't try out for that team because you just couldn't face being told no if you didn't make it. Now you live with that regret of not trying. Or you find yourself pushing people away, holding them at arm's length because you got hurt in the past and you never want to experience that again, but now you're just so lonely. Or maybe you're in that dating relationship and you compromised. You gave him everything because you thought, well, if I don't, he's gonna leave, and then you did, and he left anyways because of fear. Or maybe you're a parent. Maybe it's right now, or maybe it's in the past, but you did everything to protect your kids for those 18 years. If I can just wrap them in bubble wrap and keep them safe, I'll make all the choices for them. If they make a mistake, I'm gonna stop them like in the process. We control and we protect and we keep them safe because we're just so scared. And then at 19, the arms open up and they run off. They don't want to come home because we've been too controlling. They don't know how to make choices because they never got to make them. And now you watch their lives fall apart from a distance because we let fear control us. Now, if any of those resonate with you, I don't want you to feel bad. This is nothing new. This is the human experience. And it's the human experience in the Bible too, because what do we see? Abraham said that his wife was his sister because she was beautiful, and he was scared what other people would do to him because of that. Fear. Peter denied Jesus 3 times because he was scared of a conversation with a tiny little girl. Spies went into their promised land, and majority of them came back and said, I know you've promised this to us, God, but these men are just too big and strong. They operated in fear. And what do we miss out on when we operate in fear? We miss out on victory, or as Jesus calls it right here, the victor's crown, which was a powerful picture to these people in the first century. Because these church members in Smyrna, before they were followers of Christ, what would they do? They would go to this big stadium, 20,000 people. They would watch their heroes compete in athletic feats. And when you would win, you would get the victor's crown put on your head. And soon those people would be marched into that very same stadium where they cheered on their heroes. And then you hear other cheering and other chants. But this time, those chants were against them as they were burned and eaten by animals. But they had this picture that they were actually not the victims. They were the victors. Here's where John closes. In verse 11, it says, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. So he closes and just brings it all together once again, is that keep your eyes on the eternal and don't live in fear. Back when I was in my 20s and training to be a pastor, I would sit in these classes that teach us about, hey, what is it like to be a pastor and what do you need to know and theology and all that type of stuff. And I would look forward into my future and dream of what is it gonna be like on a Sunday morning, being up in front of people? What is it gonna be like having coffee conversations for people whose lives are falling apart? What is it gonna be like to do a wedding or funeral? And I used to think, which one is gonna be more impactful when I do a wedding or a funeral? And I thought, I think weddings. I think weddings is where I'm gonna really get people to connect with Jesus, maybe even come to my church afterwards. In fact, I even got a secondary master's on family and life ministry that wrestles with family dynamics and marriage and family and all this stuff. I thought that was gonna be my bread and butter. And so I'd sit with these couples and I'd walk them through the pre-marriage education stuff. We became friends, we had relationships. I made sure their wedding was perfect. I gave 11 out of 10 sermon at every wedding. But you know what I found? No one cares what the pastor has to say at a wedding. I mean, they're looking forward to drinking. Some of them have been drinking before they even showed up. I mean, there's a dance and food. All this stuff is happening. I would speak these words and really think I was making an impact, and I would never see people again in my life. And then there was funerals. I'd walk into a funeral. I mean, funerals are dreary, hard, challenging. It doesn't matter your opinion about Christ or if they had a relationship with Christ. It's always hard. But there's something about a funeral that people's minds and hearts and souls are open because they're thinking about eternity. And what I found time and time again is even if I brought a 6 out of 10 sermon or a 7 out of 10 sermon, if I pointed people to the truth of Jesus Christ, lives would be changed. And I would see those people again. They would show up at the church I was serving at. I would see them. I would shake their hand. They'd say, I saw you at the funeral. Thank you so much for your words. Because there's something about a funeral that opens our minds to eternity. A couple weeks ago, we had a funeral here for a member of our church. His name was Gary. Gary's one of the first people that I ever met at Redeemer. I've been here almost a year. It was almost on week 1. He gave me a phone call. He said, hey, I'm in Texas. You sent me an email. I don't know who you are. I'm not sending you emails. He said, yeah, you asked for a gift card. I was like, oh no, this has happened before. Someone saw my picture on the website. They mocked up a fake email. They messaged some members of the church saying, hey, this is Pastor Ben. I want some gift cards. By the way, I will never do this. No pastor should ever do this, by the way. And I said, wasn't me. Don't send them any money, but great to get to know you. Looking forward to meeting you when you come back to Minnesota after your nice warm winter. And so he walked through the door, and I remember this very clearly. He walked up and said, hey, I'm Gary. I said, hey, Gary, good to meet you. He's like, I'm the guy who called about the gift card. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. That was good. And I had a lot of other great conversations with Gary and about Gary telling me his life story, the impact that he's making, and the passion that he had. And so when I got the news not long ago that he had died in a car accident, I was devastated. Devastated for him and for his family, and I just hurt. But was honored to be a part of that funeral. And I sat in there and I heard the stories of his life and his legacy and the impact, how he used his life for the glory of God with what he'd been given in this life. And then I heard the message of hope. That his story did not come to a close. It was the flipping of a page. Because they were viewing it in light of eternity. You see, for every day that Gary is in heaven, eternity keeps stretching on. Wider and wider and wider and wider. And for every day that we spend in eternity, the same will be true. Which means at some point in time, that moment in eternity gets bigger than our life, and our life here gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it's only a dot. And soon that dot is not even perceivable because eternity has just stretched on longer and longer and longer as we live in the joys of being connected with one another and our Heavenly Father. And when we get that picture burned into our minds and leading our life, it sets us free. We walk away from fear and we can make a huge impact in this life for Christ. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time to gather in this place after a heavy week of life. And we just pray that you showed up in the hearts of people, that you're working in our hearts and our minds and breaking through to our souls, Lord. May we live a life that's not focused on the beauty around us, but the beauty waiting for us. May we live in light of eternity, and may that set us free. May we think of life of not of what we can get, but Lord, what we can do for our neighbors, for those around us. May we share your love and ultimately point them to walk in your way so they can be set free. Pray this all in Christ's mighty name. Amen.